Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam in Hilchos Chametz Umatzah, Perek Ches, Halacha Daled. The Rambam says over there, Umachzer hashulchan lefanav, after the person pushed away the table, he brings it back, and he says the following, Pesach zeh shana eichlim al shum shepasach hamakim al bati abiseinu b'mitzrayim. Why do we eat the carbon Pesach? Because the Eibishter passed over our houses in Mitzrayim. So first you talk about the carbon Pesach. After that he says, Umagbiya hamara biyad. Then you lift up the Maror, and you say, Maror zeh shana eichlim al shuma. Why do we eat the Maror? Because they embittered our lives. And then he picks on the Matzah. He magbiya hamatzah biyadai. He then lifts up the Matzah. And ve'omer matzah zu shana eichlim al shum shlei hisbu b'tzek shal b'seinu l'hachmitz. The matzah that we eat is because the dough of our fathers did not have a chance to become chametz, and that's why we eat matzah. So here the order is first Pesach, then Maror, and then matzah. So the question is, why does he put it in that order? Pesach, Maror, and matzah. It should be Pesach, Matzah and Maror, the way we have it in our Haggadah. And in fact, the Rambam himself, in his Haggadah, at the end of Hilchos Chametz and Matzah, he has his version of the Haggadah, and it's exactly the way we do it today. Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Yet, when he gives us the halacha, he reverses the order. So the Rabbeinu Manoach, one of the Rishonim, one of the earliest commentaries on the Rambam, and it's also cited by the Kesef Mishnah, says the following, that is actually a girsa, a reading, a version of the Mishnah in Pesachim, where it also has it in that order, Pesach, Maror, and Matzah. That's the girsa of the Rif. So apparently the Rambam had that girsa, he had that version of it, and that's why he puts it here in that order. But that just transfers the question to the Mishnah, the way the Rif has it. Why would you have the order, Pesach, Maror, and then Matzah? It makes more sense to have Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. So Rabbeinu Manoach says that the truth is that it is Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. That's the right order. Then why did the Mishnah reverse the order? Because the Mishnah is trying to tell us that the reason why we eat Maror is because of the bitterness. Which came first, the bitterness or the Exodus? First the bitterness came. So it's trying to tell us that first comes the Maror and then the Matzah. But it's hard to understand why would the Mishnah reverse the order just to teach us that lesson. It's obvious that Maror, the bitterness, came first. But if we're doing the Pesach and then Matzah and then Maror, we're not representing that idea. So why the Mishnah would reverse the order to tell us something that we already know, and there's no way of showing that that's the reality, that first came the bitterness, because we don't do it that order. We don't do Pesach, Maror, Matzah. So there's a sefer called Keser HaMelech on the Rambam, from one of the later Achreinim, who explains that there's a difference between the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when eating matzah was biblical, mitzvah min HaTorah to eat matzah, and Maror was also biblical. Al matzah isumreirim yechluhu. You're supposed to eat the carbon pesach together with matzah and Maror. So in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when matzah and Maror were equal, they decided to put Maror before matzah. Why? Because Maror has the idea of bitterness that came before the redemption. So since they're both equal, and Maror has a reason to make it come first, to preface it, because the bitterness came before the redemption, it puts Maror first. That's why the Rambam, in his Mishnah Torah, where he's talking about the way it was when we had the Korban Pesach and the days of the Beis HaMikdash, then we have Pesach, Maror, and Matzah. But in the Halachas, in his version of the Haggadah rather, where he's talking about how we do it Bizman Hazeh, it makes it very clear he's talking about how it is Bizman Hazeh. When he talks about Korban Pesach, he says Korban Pesach that our fathers ate, not what we're eating, so we're talking about in the times of Golus. If so, Maror is only Midrabanan. Bisman hazeh. Matzah is min haTorah. So matzah comes first and then maror. That's how the that's how the Keser HaMelech explains the Rambam. I think there's a simpler way of explaining the Rambam, and you find this alluded to in many Sfarim, but I'd like to elaborate on it. There's a Rosh in Arvei Pesachim, the last chapter of Pesachim, who says that maror does not really have to be a kazayas. The only reason we need a kazayas of maror is because we make a bracha al achilas maror, for eating the maror. And achila, the definition of eating throughout the Torah, is to eat the volume of a kazayas, the size of an olive. So the way Achreinim understand the Rosh, and this seems to be the simple understanding, is that if it wouldn't be for the bracha, you wouldn't need a kazayas of maror. But because we're making a bracha, we use the word achila, you have to have a kazayas. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit into the word achila. The Shagas Aryeh asks two questions. He says, number one, we know, the Gemara tells us that matzah and maror are equated to each other. They're mentioned together in the Pasuk, on matzahs umreirim. Just like matzah requires a kazayas, no one argues about that. You have to eat a kazayas of matzah. So therefore, you should have to eat a kazayas of maror. And the second question he asks, we know that there are certain foods that are forbidden where the Torah does not use the word don't eat them. And therefore, like basa b'chalav, mixture of milk and meat, klayim, the mixture of the vine and grain, they're forbidden to have any benefit from it. And if you do have any benefit, you are violating the Torah's restriction against it. So there also, even though the Torah doesn't use the word achila, nevertheless, it has to be a kazayas. If it's less than a kazayas, you're not liable for that prohibition. It's still forbidden, but it's not punishable. So here also, if for whatever reason maror is not included in the words of the Torah of eating, the word yachluhu goes on the Korban Pesach and the matzah, nevertheless, you should still have to have a kazayas. Otherwise, it's not considered that you did anything. So Reb Chaim Brisker, in his Chedushim and Shas, explains it in the following way. He says, according to the Rambam, and it seems that most Rishonim hold like this, the mitzvah of eating matzah, which we said before, and everyone agrees with that, is midaraisa, it's biblical. You're obligated biblically to eat matzah, even bisman hazeh, even in the present day and age. But matzah was also eaten together with a Korban Pesach. Al matzah sumrurim yachluhu. You had to eat the Korban Pesach together with matzah and maror. Maror, on the other hand, is only obligatory when you're eating a Korban Pesach with it. Or rather, the maror is being eaten with the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is the dominant food, and the maror is a supplement to it, an accessory to it. So therefore, bisman hazeh, in the current day and age, when we don't have the Korban Pesach, there's no biblical obligation to eat maror. It's only midrabanan, it's only rabbinical. Now, matzah, even though the Torah says to eat matzah with a Korban Pesach, we don't have the Korban Pesach, there's a separate commandment, be'erev teichlu matzahs, in the evening you should eat matzah. So there are really two obligations of matzah. One is to eat it together with a Korban Pesach, and the other one is to eat it independently of the Korban Pesach. If so, the question of the Shagas Aryeh is resolved. Because what is his question? That maror is compared to matzah. Yes, that's true. What kind of matzah is it compared to? The matzah that goes along with the Korban Pesach. So when the Torah tells you to eat the Korban Pesach, the kazayas is going on the Korban Pesach. You could eat any amount of matzah, any amount of maror. Even the matzah doesn't require a kazayas. So the maror doesn't have to be more stringent than the matzah. That's when you're talking about the obligation of maror and matzah that's an accessory to the Korban Pesach. But there's a separate independent mitzvah of eating matzah that has nothing to do with maror. And therefore, that obligation requires a kazayas. But the maror and the matzah that you eat with the Korban Pesach doesn't need a kazayas. Well, taking that, and it seems to be very obvious that that's the case. The Rambam makes it very clear that matzah is separate from the mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach with matzah and maror. So when that's the case, let's go back to the days of the Beis Hamikdash. In the times of the Beis Hamikdash, you ate a Korban Pesach, and then you would have to eat matzah and maror with it. So when we're talking about what you have to say, why are we're eating the Korban Pesach because Hashem passed over our houses, what should go next? Should matzah go next or maror go next? So the argument would be that even though matzah was eaten with a Korban Pesach, matzah also had an independent character. It was also a separate mitzvah. Maror has no other status. Maror's status is only subordinate to the Korban Pesach. Without a Korban Pesach, there is no maror. Minat Torah, midrabanan, of course, there is. But Minat Torah, there's no maror. So when you start off with Pesach, and that's what Rabbi Gamliel says, whoever didn't say these three things with the Korban Pesach didn't fulfill his obligation. When you're starting with Pesach, which is the name of the holiday that we give to the Yom Tov, so when you're talking about Pesach, of course, you start with the Korban Pesach. And then what goes next? Maror, because maror is an extension of the Korban Pesach, and that's its only status. Matzah, on the other hand, has an independent status. A matzah you say later. And that explains why in the Mishnah Torah, in the halachas, where he's talking about the times of the Beis Hamikdash, there it's Pesach, then it's accessory of maror, and then matzah. But Bizman Hazeh, nowadays, when we only have the mitzvah of matzah and Pesach, we don't have. We're just talking about the past. So when we talk about the past of Pesach, the next step is matzah, because matzah is more important than maror. Matzah is still biblically obligated, and maror is secondary. Maror is only midrabanan.